Well, hey, what is up, y'all? Hope that you're having a good weekend so far, and glad that you're here tonight. We're going to be continuing in our therapy session series. If you've been here the last several weeks, we've been going through that, hitting some really important topics. And tonight, we're going to be looking at the issue of fear. And fear is something that we all deal with, that we all have had struggles with, all the way from the top down. We have the little small fears like that we deal with, and also the big ones. And I think about, like, when I was a little kid, let me ask y'all, how many of y'all, when you were a little kid, maybe even still, you used to get scared at night when you would turn the lights off? Like, as soon as you turn the lights off, like, it's over. Like, that's it. And some of you probably still do. I don't know what it is. It's just something about darkness that as soon as the lights go off, like, it's a completely different room. Even though we just saw with the lights on like 2 seconds ago, it's just different now. That's just what darkness does. And I know for me, when I was a little kid, I grew up in a 2-story house. And there were plenty of times where, even like in middle school and high school, I would stay up later than my parents and my sister. And so I would have to turn the lights off downstairs before going upstairs to my room. And I'm telling you, like, it was, man, every time, like, that switch, it was in the kitchen, and the hallway was in front of me to go up to the stairs. And, like, when I would turn that switch off, man, like, it was time to go. And so I would sprint down the hallway and sprint up the stairs and get in my room as soon as I could, because I had to get out of the darkness downstairs, man. And I don't know what it was, but it was like, okay, lights are on, nobody's over there, okay? Lights off, somebody is over there, and they're trying to kill me. Like, that's just like the mindset that I had when I would turn the lights off to go upstairs. And of course, now, as a grown man, I don't do that anymore. I don't get scared like that in the dark in the house anymore, because now it's when I'm taking the trash out to the alley behind my house at night. And so I have this new fear. And man, like, when I take the trash out, you will never see me more alert and ready to go to war than when I'm taking the trash out at night. Like, that's it. And I'm telling you, like, I'll go out there and, like, I'll pop the gates right here, and I'll hit that latch, and then I'm like, and I'm like going up. I don't actually take my gun out there, but I'm ready to fight when I take the trash out at night, because it's just a long alley, like it's the whole length of the street. You can't see anything. It's pitch black. The street lights don't make it back there, and so I'm ready to go. And if my neighbor is ever taking out the trash at the same time as me, they're gonna get shot. No, like, I really don't take my gun out there, but we are going to fight because in an alley at night, any movement is a threat. And so I don't care if it's a neighbor's dog, if it's a little kid next door, like, they better not go out there when I'm taking the trash out at night, because that's just it. And the reason why is because when it comes to turning off the lights when I was a little kid, or now taking the trash out to the dark alley as a grown man, I'm doing those things driven by fear. And the way that I'm handling myself in those situations is driven by fear. And the reason why I share these stories is because whether it's turning off the lights or something much more serious, I know that a lot of people live fear-driven. A lot of people in every area of their life, or in many areas, we are driven by fear. And some of us, we're so fear-driven that we don't even realize it, and we're actually thriving in our fear. But eventually, that's going to cause problems, and it's going to catch up to you. And in the meantime, if you're living by fear, you're not living by faith, because you can't do both. And so I know that fear, it's a massive issue for many people, some more than others, but it is something that we all battle. We all have things that we fear. And the problem is that as a believer, God says in His Word over 200 times, do not fear, over and over and over again. Do not fear, do not fear, do not fear. And God says that we have nothing to fear. And so when we allow fear to run and fuel certain areas of our lives, the reality is that we're not trusting God as much as we could. And the good news is that we don't have to live in fear, that we can come out of that fear doesn't have to control us. And I want to say that feeling afraid and having feelings of fear isn't wrong. Like, it's okay to be afraid. It's just what we do with the fear that matters. Like, when something happens and you are afraid, or you have a fear in your life, do you address it, or do you start to let it consume you? Because we don't want to let fear consume us. That's when it becomes a problem. And so I want to make that clarification. Like, we're all going to be afraid at times. We're all going to go through things in life that cause real fear for us, that are valid. But we've got to address those fears. We don't want to carry those fears around. We don't want those fears to take root and start to cause problems for us in our lives. And so tonight, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 14. And we're going to be looking at this story of God delivering the Israelites from a situation they find themselves in. And we're going to be looking at a couple of things in that chapter. What fear causes us to do and what can cause fear. And then also we're going to look at what God says about fear and some important truths for us to know when dealing with fear. And so Exodus chapter 14, we'll be reading all the way through verse 31, but throughout the night. We're not going to read it all up front. And so we're going to read verses 1 through 5 to get us started. And so in verse 1, chapter 14, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-Zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord.' And they did so. And when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, 'What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?'" So the first thing that we see tonight about fear is that fear happens when you feel like you have no control. When you feel trapped, when you feel like a situation is completely out of your hands, a lot of times that's when fear sets in. In verse 3, it says that the Israelites, they're going to be shut in. They're going to be trapped. They're going to have the army of Pharaoh in one direction and then the sea behind them. And so they're going to be trapped in this situation, and they're going to experience a bit of claustrophobia. Right? We've all maybe experienced that. You're in a small space and you can't get out, and you can't do anything about it yourself, and so you're trapped. And that causes real fear for people. And some people, we have what I would say is like spiritual claustrophobia. And you have a lot of things in your life, a lot of different emotional things going on, a lot of baggage that you're carrying around, a lot of issues in your life emotionally and spiritually, and it's causing you to feel trapped within your own self. And I know a lot of people that deal with that. They have all these issues and all these fears in their lives, and it causes them to walk around in handcuffs. And they feel trapped in their fear. And maybe that describes you. And we know that the Israelites, they're about to experience this. They're going to be trapped, and they're going to realize that they have no control over the situation that they're in. And that's when we as humans feel like we don't have control, that's when we become fearful. I've shared with y'all throughout the semester how my wife is pregnant, and we did find out the gender finally, and we're having a girl, and so super excited to be a girl dad, and her name's going to be Hallie Jade Gentry, and so we're super excited about that. But the thing about when I found out that Tori was pregnant, man, I was so excited, and a lot of just joy came over me. But at the same time, I immediately started to have this fear because I knew that when we found out, she was only about 4 weeks pregnant, about a month pregnant when we found out, and that really until you get out of that first trimester at 12 weeks, there's a lot of concern for a miscarriage, for losing the baby in the womb. And I know a lot of people that have had miscarriages. When you get to that stage in your life, you'll realize how common that actually is if you haven't already. Like my parents, they had 2 before they had my older sister and myself, and lots of other family members on both sides, hers and mine. And so for weeks, I couldn't help but I was living in fear. And I was fearful. Every doctor's appointment that would come up, I was living in fear that, man, like, what if we lost the baby? Like, what? Because I know it happens a lot. And the chances were like 50% within that first trimester. And so I was just, at 7 weeks, we had our first sonogram, and I was like, man, I'm so excited, but at the same time, I'm terrified. And so then we found out, okay, the baby's healthy. And then, but then I was like, man, we're not out of the clear yet. And so I was living in fear. And then at week 12, we had a sonogram, and everything was healthy. And I was like, okay, I can breathe now. Like now I can kind of relax. But for those weeks, I was living in fear. Every doctor's appointment, I was waiting in fear instead of trusting in God. Worried that we would lose the baby instead of celebrating the life and getting excited about that. I was letting that fear consume me. And the thing is that Tori's pregnancy is 9 months long, and so for the most part, it's 100% completely out of my control, minus doing what I can to help her get rest and stay generally healthy and be comfortable. But for the whole 9 months while she's pregnant, like I can't live in fear that whole time. Like, I mean, I could, but at what cost? I mean, do I want to give up my joy and my health and my sleep and my ability to be present because I'm just worried about the future? Like, I don't want that. And I know that maybe you're in a situation and you don't want that either. Because fear, it keeps us from being present. It keeps us from enjoying the moments in life that we could be enjoying. And we don't want to live in fear, but it's easy to fall into. And so I can either live in fear because I have no control, or I can take those fears to God because He is in control, and I can trust Him to take care of my wife and my baby. But either way, I'm not going to be in control. So one option makes me a ball of stress and fear for 9 months, and the other option gives me comfort and peace when my fears do arise. And so I ask, where in your life do you fear something because you can't control it? What area of your life has fear taken root in? And I know for me, I'm going to have to keep that in check. And probably even after Hallie comes, there's all kinds of things that I have no idea about that are going to cause me fears and worries with my kid. And so I don't know what area of your life it could be, but I know that all of us have things in our lives that we can't control. And so a lot of us, naturally, we struggle with fear instead of trusting God. And the thing is that in verses 3 and 4, what God is saying is basically, we're about to see a miracle. Something that God's about to do that we talk about thousands of years later. And so the Israelites, little do they know, they're about to see God move powerfully. And I know a lot of us, we want to see God move powerfully in our lives, but a lot of times if we let that fear consume us, we're not going to see God move in the way that we could. We're not going to experience some of the things that we possibly could if we would take those fears to God. Again, real fears, valid fears, but how we handle them is everything. And God's actually about to show us that His power is going to be shown in our place of weakness. And this is what God is going to do with the Israelites. And so I don't know what area of your life that fear is consuming you, but tonight maybe you need to let that go so that you can see God move in that situation. The next thing that we're going to see is that fear happens when we feel like something is coming toward us for harm. We're going to read verses 6 through 10 of chapter 14. It says, "So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. And the Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-Zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly, and the people of Israel cried out to the Lord." What the Israelites saw before them would naturally cause all of us to be afraid, right? Like it just mentioned this giant army of 600 of the best chariots, and then all the other chariots of Egypt, all with officers over them and armies. And so we know that the Israelites, they look up and they see this massive army coming to kill them and capture them and enslave them again, and they have nowhere to go. And so naturally they're going to feel afraid of the harm that's coming towards them. But here's the thing. When you're afraid for very legitimate reasons, who or what do you look to? When you're afraid, what do you do with that fear? Many of the times in my life when I've been afraid or fearful of something that was going to harm me, or maybe something that I felt like was going to keep harming me, a lot of times it's been something that I allowed to enter my life in the first place. Like I've shared about it a lot this semester, but once I was set free from my addiction, I was free, but I was afraid that the effects of it would stick around and stay with me for a long time. I had a fear that I would continue to experience the negative impacts of that moving forward. I was afraid that was going to burden me throughout my life. And I know tonight in this room that there are people in here, and maybe you've recently made a mistake, or in your past you've made a lot of mistakes, and you're afraid of how it's going to affect you moving forward. You're fearful of the way that it could impact you. Maybe you're even afraid that how God's going to view you. You're fearful that maybe God's done with you. Fearful that maybe you're too far gone for God. Fearful that maybe you're too far gone to right the track. And that's a real fear that you have, something that we've done, that we've brought into our lives that's causing us to be afraid. And listen, that doesn't make our fears false just because we maybe brought it upon ourselves. But my response to that fear needs to be to surrender it to God. If I want to escape and find refuge from the things in my life that are harming me, whether it be stuff from bad relationships or addictions, things that are self-inflicted, then I need to surrender those things to the one who can protect me moving forward, to the one that can heal me moving forward, to the one that can handle those fears. And so maybe tonight you have a fear because of something in your life that you've done, and I believe tonight that you can bring that to God and surrender it to Him. Now, this isn't the situation with the Israelites. They were actually called into this fearful situation by God. Like, this wasn't self-inflicted. They didn't want this. They didn't do anything to be here. This was a situation that just happened in their life, completely out of their control. And I know a lot of times we see stuff like that happen in our own lives or in someone else's, and you're kind of like, man, why would God allow that? Why would God allow them to be in this kind of spot? And for the Israelites, it's because He wanted to turn their fear into dependence. He wanted to turn their fear into trust in Him. And so I've mentioned that there might be people in here with a fear tonight because of something that you've done, but there's also many people in here tonight that are afraid and fearful because of something that you're going through that you didn't bring upon yourself. Like the Israelites, they didn't do this to themselves, but God is going to use it, and He can use it. And maybe it's to turn that fear into dependence. Maybe that's how He works it together for your good. Maybe you come out of it stronger. Maybe you come out of it with a bigger faith. Maybe God is going to use it in your life later on. And maybe that's what God wants to do with that fear that you are dealing with tonight. And I started to think, and I was thinking about a family that that went to the church that I grew up in, or still goes there now. And Leanne and Corey Edelman, and they have 2 young daughters. And several years ago, Leanne, as someone who's just like in her mid to late 30s and so still relatively young, she found out that she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And this cancer, it was not the best case scenario. Like, it wasn't like stage 1, like they caught it super, super early. And so it definitely wasn't a good situation that could be handled like no problem. She was diagnosed with this cancer, and immediately, like, they knew that this cancer, it was going to harm Leanne. Regardless of the outcome, like, it was going to harm her, it was going to break her body down, it was going to put her through a lot of physical and emotional turmoil. And that there was no way except for her to go through it. There was no way around it. And so for the family, for her husband Corey, and for their daughters, and for her, obviously, fear was a very reasonable response for them and for her. And I know that they felt some, but I watched and I witnessed, and the family, they didn't surrender to that fear. Instead, I watched her and her family as they actually surrendered their fears and worries to God. And I watched as through those months, as she just trusted God as she went through this really horrible process and this horrible trial. And I watched God take care of her fears. And Leanne, she still had to go through it. She still probably battled fears and worries daily, but instead of letting it consume her, it actually pushed her closer to God. And she came out of it a stronger woman of God with a big faith and a story to share, and that God has used in her life to help others, to encourage others. And so God used this fearful situation to make and help Leanne to be more dependent on Him, to trust Him more. He used something in her life that she didn't bring upon herself, that she didn't ask for, that nobody would want to go through, and worked her fears into trust. And I remember her sharing about it, that regardless of the outcome, that even if the cancer wasn't defeated, that even if that wasn't the outcome, that God was using in her life, even during the process, she was experiencing God more than ever before, and that she knew that God had a purpose for that. And so she did not surrender to her fears. She surrendered her fears to God. But here's the thing, for the Israelites in this situation, They weren't living dependent. And they are allowing their fears to consume them and start to cause doubts and worries, and it's starting to control how they're viewing and responding to the situation. And so maybe tonight you're going through something that you didn't bring upon yourself, and maybe you're allowing those fears to get the best of you. And tonight I want you to know that God can handle those fears if you will bring them to Him, whatever it is that you're going through. However long you've been carrying it, however long you've been in fear, God can handle those fears if you will bring them to Him tonight. And the next thing that we're going to see about fear, I think one that a lot of us can relate to, is that fear causes us to think the worst of situations. We find out something and we immediately think of the worst possible scenario, the worst possible outcome. I want to read it, verses 11 and 12. It says, "They said to Moses, 'Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness.'" And so the Israelites, they did a self-diagnosis here, and immediately, they realized, okay, there's no way out, and so we're going to die. That's just it. There's no way out. We're going to die. Naturally, they assumed that, like many of us probably would. They went to the worst possible outcome, which was death. And it's not like a crazy thought. Many of us would likely think the same thing in this situation. But at the same time, thinking the worst of situations, it can become a habitual habit, causing us to constantly live in fear every time that we encounter something difficult in life. This can become a really bad habit, always looking for the worst possible outcome, always assuming the worst possible outcome. And what it does is that it's going to cause us to not trust God and to have a lacking faith. And as I said at the beginning, you can't live by faith when you're living by fear. I remember when I was in 6th grade, I got the courage to ask out the first girl that I liked, and I was rejected, and just stone cold, pew pew pew, shot down, that was it. She said no in front of my friends, and so super embarrassing and discouraging. And I remember I was a little 10 or 11-year-old in 6th grade, immediately thinking later that day, man, what if no girl ever says yes to me? I'm just single for life. And I, as a little 10-year-old, and I was well, what if I never date anyone? And so, that was my immediate thought, was to think of the worst possible outcome. And I, obviously, I was wrong. But as a little 10 or 11-year-old, it was, to me, it was a really rational thought. I was she said no, that's it. That was my shot. I shot and I missed. And I'm done. Everyone's going to reject me for the rest of my life. And so my mind immediately drove me to the worst possible outcome. And the thing is that a lot of people, because of little moments like that, we end up having a real fear of rejection throughout our lives. People have a real fear of not being enough for people. Fear of rejection is a thing that people struggle with even into young adulthood. It's a real thing. And for some people, that fear of rejection is going to lead us to always thinking of the worst possible outcome with every person that we encounter. And you start to worry that you're always going to be rejected, that you're never going to be enough for anyone, that it's never going to end. And that's a real fear that people have. But then also, maybe some people in the room can relate more to always thinking the worst when it comes to health situations and health issues that arise. Right now, if anyone has a headache, it's oh no, I have COVID. I got a headache, I have COVID. Or I'm sniffling today, and we are in Lubbock. It's really windy, so probably not allergies, but it is. And so it's that thing where immediately, every symptom ever right now is COVID. It's a crazy disease like that, literally every symptom. And so anytime anyone experiences anything, it's I have COVID. That's it, I got it. It was only a matter of time. And it's kind of well, you might not. Could just have a headache. Drink more water. I don't know. Take Advil. There's a lot of other possibilities that it could be, but we're all kind of assuming the worst right now in that. But sometimes you could be experiencing real health issues, and it kind of causes us to self-diagnose with the worst possible outcome. For me, a couple years ago, I was experiencing some pretty bad health issues with my intestines, and so I was having some internal bleeding and a lot of discomfort and pain. And so I finally was I probably should go to the doctor, but first, let me Google my symptoms and let me see what I have. And so I go to WebMD, and I type in all my symptoms. I have colon cancer, and I am going to die. And so my wife and I were supposed to get married in a couple months, and I was like, listen, we can still do this, but I have cancer. And so that was just like the worst possible outcome. And she was like, you're an idiot, and you should probably go to the doctor. And I was like, yeah, probably not a bad idea. So after I self-diagnosed, I went to the doctor. Didn't have colon cancer, shocker. And but I did end up actually being diagnosed with a colon disease. But thankfully, like, God has been really graceful, and it's something that can be easily handled and kept in remission, and it's not something that I have to worry too much about. But initially, I allowed my fears to consume me, and I thought, man, like, that's it. Like, this is the worst possible outcome, and it's finally come true. And I know that it's really easy to do that in every area of our lives. And I started to think, man, like, what if instead of thinking about the worst possible outcome or the outcome that will hurt you the most, what if instead, like when we had a fear arise or something that caused us to be afraid, what if instead our first thought was to take it to God? What if, it's a wild thought, but what if our first thought was to take it to God and say, God, whatever it is, I pray that your will would be done and that your peace would rule over my heart? Like, what if instead of always thinking of the worst possible outcome, like that being my first go-to, what if I went to God first and asked him for peace regardless of what the outcome would really be? Because sometimes we might actually experience the worst possible outcome. And because let's not pretend like just because the Israelites are going to make it through in this story, after assuming the worst, sometimes we might actually experience the worst possible outcome. Sometimes that worst case scenario becomes the real scenario for us. Like right now, I mentioned COVID, and right now we're in the midst of this global pandemic, and COVID is obviously a very real disease, and it has real impacts on people's lives, and obviously the most obvious thing is that it has an impact on your health, and it's possible that it can even take someone's life, and that's a scary thing, to know that that thing is going around, and that, you know, although, yeah, most people might be fine, some people won't be fine. Especially, you know, some of us can be really fearful of someone that we love who might be at risk for various reasons, or maybe even you yourself could be at risk for various reasons. So you have this real fear of this thing going around. But here's the thing, is that even in the midst of this global pandemic that has a real possible worst outcome, we have some options in how we handle those fears in the midst of this. We can look at the virus and something like it, and we can see the real dangers and the threats that it presents, and we can allow our fear of it to consume us and just hold us down every single day as long as it's around for the next however many months or years, and we can constantly worry about it and constantly be in fear of it and allow it to consume us in a way that it affects our day-to-day life more than it ever should have. And we can live and let that real fear consume us and take root in our lives. Or we can look at the virus and acknowledge the seriousness of it, acknowledge the real possible outcomes, and do our best to take proper precautions to prevent the spread and to keep ourselves or someone we love from getting it. But then instead of letting that fear consume us and take root and drive us over the next however long it lasts, we can take those fears to God, and we can depend on him through it and trust him through it. There's really only two options, and maybe you find yourself with COVID or with another issue in your life kind of wrestling in between those two. I'm telling you, like, fear can consume or it can drive you closer to God. And so tonight, has your fear been driving you closer to God, or has it been consuming you and pushing you away? And I believe that God is inviting you to bring those fears to him tonight. The next thing that we're going to see as we begin to look at what God says about our fear is that whatever it is that we fear, God gets the final say. And then I want to read verses 13 through 18. It says, "And Moses said to the people, 'Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. And so we see here that God is giving them a promise. God is promising to Moses and to the Israelites that he will deliver them. God is promising that he is going to save them. They will see his salvation on this day. And God is always faithful to his promises. He told Moses, I will deliver you, and therefore it is going to happen, and it does happen. We see that God does fulfill this promise. God does make a way for them. God does step in and fight for them. And it turns out that the Israelites' fears weren't bigger than God's salvation for them. And for us today as his children, our fears are not bigger than the salvation that Jesus paid for on the cross. God has never not followed through on a promise that he has made to us. And what a powerful thing that we can cling to in the middle of our fears when they do arise. When we do have those fears, we can cling to the hope of Jesus on the cross. God says that we can find comfort in him when we fear, and he will follow through on that. God says that we can find peace that surpasses all understanding, even when our worst fears become a reality, and he follows through on that. God says our hope is found in the cross, even in the face of death, and he follows through on that. God says that all who are weary can find rest in him, and he always follows through on that. And this is the invitation tonight, that all those who are weary with battling fears and worries tonight and real things going on in your life, that if you will bring those fears to Jesus and realize that you don't have to live consumed by those any longer, that you can find peace and hope and comfort and salvation in the Lord that will stand firm when fears arise. Even though we might not be spared from trials and tribulations and sufferings, because we know that due to this broken world, because of sin, that the Bible doesn't promise us a life without hardships and loss. The Bible doesn't promise us that something that's going to cause us to fear won't come into our lives. Like, we're going to face things. But even in something as serious as death, or even in the biggest of our fears, Jesus is our hope, and God gets the final say because of the finished work of Christ on the cross. And for the Israelites, their fears were going to be turned into dependence on God. And so tonight, will you let your fears turn into hope and security in Jesus? The next thing that we're going to see, the truth about God and our fear, is that God is our light in the darkness of fear. And we're going to read in verse 19 and 22 through 22. It says, Then the angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness. And it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And so we see in this situation that God was literally their light and source of protection in this situation. God literally lit the way. He made a way when there was no way. Like, he actually stepped in and fought for them and did exactly what he said he was going to do. God responded to their fears exactly the way that he said that he would. He stepped in and he was their hero. He delivered them in this situation. And I think about, for me, there was a time when I was little, and I was stuck at home with my mom, and there was a yellow jacket in the house. And I was really young, so I barely remember it, but I know that I was terrified of yellow jackets, still am. If you see me in a yellow jacket, you'll probably see me running that way. I don't like to get stung. And so I remember my mom even more so was terrified, and my dad, he couldn't leave work to come and kill it. And so we're stuck in the house with this yellow jacket. And I remember my mom, she was looking outside, and she just happened to see a cop drive by. And so she frantically goes out there, and she's like waving this cop down. And he probably thought it was something much more serious. But sure enough, he was happy to come in and kill the wasp for us that was going to kill us. And so, yeah, it was going to kill us for sure. But he comes in and he kills it. I remember as a little kid thinking how much of a hero that cop was that day to me and to my mom. And I share that very light story to make a much bigger point that God is our light and our hero when we are afraid in much more serious situations. In the middle of the Israelites' fears, God showed up. God showed up in their fear and gave them light and made a way for them to pass through. And this is exactly what God did for us when he sent his son Jesus to die on the cross. He gave us a light and a hope to cling to when there was none. He made a way when there was no way for us back to God. And so tonight, I'm hoping that we can see that when no one else shows up, Jesus will. When nothing else has a response to our fears, Jesus does. When nothing else can comfort us in our fears, Jesus will. And when nothing else can give us hope, Jesus can. Jesus always shows up for his children. Will you accept that invitation tonight? And the final thing that we're going to see is that when you fear God, you don't have to fear anything else. It says in verse 23, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord, in the pillar of fire and of cloud, looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord had used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. So we see here, the Israelites, they went from fearing the Egyptians to allowing their fear to consume them, to now having this fear of the Lord who delivers them. They went from being consumed by their fears to being consumed by the love and protection of God. And when we were studying this passage, it made us think of a quote from a famous theologian, Michael Scott. In season 2, episode 6, don't ask how I know that, he says this: "Would I rather be feared or loved? Both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me." Now, The Office is the best show ever. Now, if you, this is kind of funny, but if you think about it, it gives us a slightly inaccurate but kind of accurate truth about God. Like God, he doesn't want us to fear him like, oh no, I can't be around him. It's a fear like, look at what God can do. Look at his power. Look at his wrath. Look at his justice, but look at the love that he has for me. Look at the lengths he will go to for me. This God loves me. This God loves you. When we see what God can do here, it's pretty terrifying when we think about it. But it's also comforting because that God is for you. Fear of whatever circumstance might be in your life, fear of a global pandemic, fear of losing a loved one, fear of the outcome of an election, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of health issues, fear of the future, fear of mistakes that you've made, fear of anything is displaced when I realize that this God loves me. 1 John 4:18 says, "Perfect love casts out fear." When I was a little kid, my dad had put my sister and I into a closet in the middle of our house because a tornado was coming through our city. And I remember just being so scared, so terrified, afraid. But I remember my dad, when he put us in that closet, I said, "Dad, aren't you going to come in the closet?" And he said, "There's not room for me." And so he stayed out. And he was making sure that the front door didn't blow open. He was looking for ways that he could protect us, ways that he could keep us safe. He was standing watch, and he was ready to do anything to protect us. And this is exactly what God does for us. But even more so, when we're afraid, when things happen in life that cause us to fear, we have a God who is fully in control, who protects us like a good father, who's gone before us, who comes behind us, who stands beside us. We have a God we can bring our fears to find comfort, peace, and protection that this world and nothing in it can offer. Your fears and my fears are valid in this world, but they are overcome by our Heavenly Father. So tonight, will you bring your fears to God? Will you ask God to help you to start living by faith instead of being fear-driven like maybe you have been? The Israelites, they were afraid. And so they lifted up their eyes and they saw what was coming towards them. They saw the army, but instead of lifting their eyes to God, they focused on that fear, and that fear consumed them. They lifted their eyes to God and to the Israelites instead of lifting their eyes to the one who went before them. And so when you're afraid, who or what do you look to? Because I believe that Jesus is calling us to look to him tonight, the one who's in control, the one who's on the throne, the one who can handle our fears. Will you look to God tonight with whatever it is that's going on